Hi, I'm Sunil Badami and welcome to another Roaring Stories live author event with Facebook Live at the Royal Oak Hotel in Balmain. We'll have time for questions later, so if you'd like to ask our guest Garry Linnell a question, you'll have time to do so here in the Royal Oak and on Facebook Live. Just post your questions underneath the comments. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to the knowledge embedded forever in the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. Now, before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping, but I'd like to start with well, would you like to hear a sick joke, Garry?
I think we're going to have to.
Okay, so the common cold, the flu, and COVID walk into a bar. Actually, I won't tell you. We don't want it to go viral, do we? And that's also why it's important, if you're here in the audience tonight, that you've registered with the QR code outside at the Royal Oak at Balmain tonight. Now, please remember to turn your phones to silent. You are welcome to take photos of Garry and I. We have tried to buff our heads a little for the occasion. But if you do, please remember to turn your flash off. And please share your thoughts and pictures on Instagram at roaring stories _stories, Twitter at roaring stories, on Facebook on roaring stories 268, and remember to use the hashtags roaring stories and Moonlite with an ITE. Now, the former AFP or Australian Federal Police Commissioner Sir Colin Woods described the Australian fascination with bushrangers as Ned Kelly syndrome. And the obsession was so great and perceived to be so serious that bushranger films were banned in New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria for most of the 20th century. It's funny though, because the world's first full-length feature film was 1906's The Story of the Kelly Gang. And it's a story that's been retold on screen countless times, whether most recently last year on Stan. And from Sidney Nolan's iconic paintings to Peter Carey's Booker Prize-winning novel, Ned Kelly and bushrangers in general have featured heavily in our literary and historical imagination. Now, for those of you who are Balmain locals, you might be interested to know that we've got our own bushranger legend. If you wander down to genteel Elkington Park down by the water and Dawn Fraser Pool, you'll be retracing the steps of Frederick Ward, better known as Captain Thunderbolt, who escaped Sydney's Alcatraz, Cockatoo Island in the 1850s and set off from what was once known as White Horse Point on a white horse all the way to Thunderbolt's Way up near Dorrigo, where over a century later the infamous murderer Malcolm Naden also hid out for nearly a decade. But if you thought all bushrangers were dirt poor Irish roustabouts, anti-heroically rebelling against the troopers, think again. From the Chinese bandit Sam Poo, who ranged around Coffs Harbour, to Thunderbolt's Aboriginal wife, Mary Ann Bugg, the history of bushranging is as complex and multicultural as Australia is. And there's no more flamboyant or tragic figure than the poetry-loving, Bible-thumping, possibly gay Captain Moonlite.
You forgot gun-toting.
There's only so many present participles I can stick into the intro. But you stick to your guns, Garry, so to speak. Captain Moonlite, with an ITE, who with his dearest friend and a motley gang brought the storied era of bushrangers to a torrid and bloody end. And to bring that story to life, well, you know, from opening up a newspaper to turning on the radio, you'd know Garry Linnell and his work. He's one of Australia's most experienced and acclaimed journalists and editors, who's won several awards for his writing, including a Walkley for Best Feature Writing. He's been Editor-in-Chief of The Bulletin, Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Director of News and Current Affairs for the Nine Network, and Editorial Director for Fairfax. He spent 4 years as co-host of The Breakfast Show on 2UE with John Stanley, and he's also the author of 4 other books: Football Limited, The Inside Story of the AFL, Raylene, Sometimes Beaten, Never Conquered, Playing God, The Rise and Fall of Gary Ablett, and last year's best-selling Buckley's Chance. Everybody at the Royal Oak and on Facebook, please welcome Garry Linnell.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Captain Thunderbolt, Captain Starlight, Ben Hall, and of course Ned Kelly. Why are Australians so obsessed with bushrangers?
Are we obsessed with bushrangers, or are we more obsessed with crime figures? Because if you go on Netflix, I was looking at the top 10 shows on Netflix the other day, they're almost 80% are crime related. I mean, who doesn't like a great British crime drama or a crime series? I mean, the BBC seem to do them extraordinarily well. If you look at the top selling books, a lot of them are crime related, and particularly true crime as well. When I was growing up, I pored over the books. They used to come out in almanacs. So you'd see Ned Kelly be on the cover, because there was no escaping Ned Kelly. But then you'd go through the pages and there'd be Mad Dog Morgan, who was shot dead in 1865. And when they finally hauled his body back to an old hut, they called a photographer in, and one of the very first photographers, and they used little matchsticks to prop his eyes open so that he looked more lifelike in the photograph, because they didn't want a completely dead-looking man sitting there. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a dead body. And I went, oh, this is incredible. And that's that sense of macabre, that sense of looking at a train wreck. And I also think, my theory is that white Australia was very young in the 1850s, 1860s and 1870s. We hadn't been around long enough to form our own myths. I mean, the first people had their myths, and they stretched back more than 100,000 years. But we'd been here for less than 100 years. And I think because we didn't have a King Arthur, and we didn't have a Beowulf, and we didn't have all of those great legendary mythical figures from the past, suddenly these men who were able to head out into the bush, live on their own in a pretty unforgiving country compared to the European forests and countryside that most people associated it with. They went out there, they scrimped, lived off the land, and periodically went in and made a raid, and they were held up as heroes. People loved them. They were revered in central New South Wales with Captain Thunderbolt. The Bush Telegraph, which was essentially one man on a very tired horse going from town to town, bringing months-old newspapers and mail, he would let them know that the troopers were on the way, and suddenly the word would just spread on this Bush Telegraph that the troopers were coming, and Thunderbolt and the rest of his outlaws would know to go and hide in the hills for a while and bide their time, and then they'd come back. But by the 1860s and early 1870s, you've got this phenomenal change happening in Australia along with the rest of the world. It was called the Second Industrial Revolution. So you've got a guy in America, Thomas Edison, who's tinkering with he's just invented the phonograph, which is going to revolutionise modern culture. But he's also tinkering with a long-lasting light bulb. And he's actually plucked this is a small little fact, but he's plucked a whisker from a friend's beard, because they had very long beards back then, and was using that as a filament in part of his experiment to try and get the globe to glow for a lot longer time. It naturally failed. He tried banana skins as well. They eventually settled on a piece of cotton. So you've got him. You've got in Canada, in the back of a farmhouse, in what he called his dreaming place, Alexander Graham Bell is putting together, experimenting with sending his voice using electric pulses. You've got all of these. You've got a guy with a droopy moustache in the back of a tin shed in Mannheim in Germany, Carl Benz. He's mucking around with a two-stroke engine that's about to become the motor car. You've got the electric telegraph. And I think I say in the book, it's like crucifixes on the Appian Way. Right across Australia, you've suddenly got these electrical pulses and dots and dashes coming through, bringing news to Australia that would have taken 6 months in the past via ship. So you've got all of these changes happening, and suddenly there's nowhere left to hide for these bushrangers. And that's when we start getting into this era, the early 1870s, mid-1870s, when you've got the Kelly gang hiding out in the northeastern ridges of Victoria, and you've got Captain Moonlite sitting in a Pentridge prison cell, stewing and thinking about what he's going to do when he finally gets out.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because on one hand we have the lionisation of bushrangers, but for a long part of Australian history, pretty much most settled Australian history, there was a great shame about convict lineage.
It was the convict stain. And by the 1870s as well, you've got this new flourishing industrial society in Sydney and Melbourne particularly. And you've also got this growing resentment about these bushrangers. I mean, they thought that they'd wiped them all out in 1870 when they shot Captain Thunderbolt dead and took photographs of him as well. And they thought that was the end of the era. And they'd brought in new laws, so the Convict Apprehension Act and the Felony Act in 1865, which meant that anyone could go and shoot a bushranger because they were outside the law. That's where that whole outlaw sort of term came from. Very similar to the Wild West, but our east here was a hell of a lot more wild than what the Americans experienced with their gunslingers. And by then, society was becoming a little bit more conscious of the fact that they wanted Australia to be seen, this group of colonies, they wanted to be seen as a mature nation. And there was already talk about becoming a Commonwealth, already talk about becoming a nation in our own right and not just being subjected to the rule of law from Britain. And to do that, they had to prove that we weren't just a bunch of boisterous, Irish bushrangers and convicts. And it really struck me. I mean, I sat there in high school at the back of the history class, throwing wads of paper at people's heads, not paying much attention, because I think, like a lot of us, we've looked on white Australian history. It's like that uncle who turns up on Christmas Day and 3 hours later he's snoring in the corner of the room with a lampshade over his head. We're a bit embarrassed by our past. It's not a rich history. And yet when you delve into it, I'm constantly astonished by the characters and the people there. William Buckley, when I was researching his story, just completely blew me for six. Some of the extraordinary figures around in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And so here you've got this changing of the guard. And in 1868, Queen Victoria has sent her second son, Prince Alfred, on a tour of the colonies. He's been to South Africa. He arrives in Australia. What happens? This mad Irishman shoots him. They're over at a picnic in Clontarf, and he's walked up behind him and fired a gun. And fortunately, the prince was wearing these very thick elastic braces holding up his pants, and the bullet just managed to graze one of the braces, and that essentially saved his life. A couple of months later, down the gangplank of a ship from New Zealand arrives Captain Moonlite, Andrew George Scott, limping down, and he walks into this completely hostile towards Irish people. Henry Parkes, the colonial secretary, is talking about removing funding for Catholic schools. There's this enormous backlash against the Irish. And up until that point, a lot of the Irish, the bushrangers had Irish blood in them from somewhere. The Captain Moonlite, the Starlight, all of these captains had come from the white boys back in Ireland. And they were, the repressed Irish who would often rise up. They wore white uniforms, a little bit like the KKK at one stage, you could say. And they'd sneak into the English landlord properties at night, hamstring their cattle, break their fences. It was their way of sort of getting back. And they often used those names, Captain Moonlight, L-I-T-E, Starlight, very, very common names back then. And they brought them out here with them, and they adopted them. And that's why the linkage between the bushrangers and the Irish is extraordinarily strong. But you've got that convict stain there, and they want to get rid of them now, and they'll do anything to try and get rid of these bushrangers and get rid of this embarrassment, because they want to prove that we're a mature nation.
As I mentioned before, Ned Kelly seems to have been written about exhaustively. Why has Moonlight been so relatively neglected, and what drew you to him apart from the fact that maybe there weren't as many books about him?
Well, I find him, and I think he's definitely far more interesting and charismatic and controversial and just plain interesting than Ned Kelly ever was. Ned Kelly was a thug, and in cold blood he shot policemen. And there is no getting away from that. You can have all the Kelly apologists around the country and they'll go on and they love it. They'll bang on for hours telling you what a great man he was and how he was going to set up his own republic in northeastern Victoria. And it's all mythology, that. But I think the reason that Moonlite was an accidental bushranger. Extraordinary life. You know, do you want me to give you a little bit of background? And
Yeah.
he's born in 1845 in January in Northern Ireland, in a small town called Rathfreeland. And his father is the local justice of the peace. He's born into essentially wealth and privilege for that time. A few months after he's born, the spores of this virus are hitting the soil of Northern Ireland, and it will contaminate the potato crop and force 2 million Irish people to leave their homeland, you know, the great diaspora. Out they go. They head out and change the world, change the history of the world. Millions die. The famine hits them. There's plenty of food in Ireland, no doubt about that. Lots of grazing paddocks, there's plenty of beef, plenty of wheat, but the English are keeping it all that for the larders back home in London, and they're sending it all back. So, I mean, they rise up, but Andrew George Scott doesn't experience any of this. He sees all of the poverty around, but his family live in a manor on the top of the hill. His father presides over the courts, and then they lose their fortune, and he loses his job due to a change in government, and they're forced to leave Northern Ireland, and they get on a ship, the Black Eagle, and go to New Zealand. Now, New Zealand are in the midst of the New Zealand wars with the Maori. They're trying to increase their stock of good white Christian English subjects, and so they're offering 40 quid for every family to come out, take up 40 acres of land. So the Scots arrive there, and back in Ireland there was always a word around the small town that there was a drop of madness in their blood, and sometimes it skipped a generation, but they were prone to, well, I guess what we would call a form of mental illness these days. And it was certainly prevalent in Andrew George Scott. On the ship going out, some of the crew thought he was a terrific young bloke. He was about 16 or 17 when they emigrated. But there were days and hours when he just went off, shouting, talking to himself, staring forlornly into the distance. And they tried to keep away from him. He joined the local Waikato militia over there, saw a lot of action, was shot several times and wounded. And underwent a very long convalescence. He was accused of malingering at one stage, which would have really, I think, damaged his psyche. He'd been raised on this notion that dignity and honour were the key things. He'd been taught the classics at school. He went and he was a cadet with the British Navy for a year and a half and trained on the Britannica. So he'd been schooled in all of the right way. And he had this incredible notion that a man had his honour, and that was the key thing that you had to stick to throughout your life. He applied to become a policeman. He was knocked back, and I think partly because of the malingering rumours that surrounded him. So he jumped on a ship and came to Australia in 1868 and went to Melbourne. Family friends were involved in the Anglican Church. He had an interview with Charles Perry, who was the Archbishop of Melbourne, and he said, "You're a great material young man. I'm going to appoint you a lay reader. I want you to head out into country Victoria and dispense the word of the Lord."
So how did he go from saintliness to sin?
I think that streak of madness kicked in. He was an appalling narcissist, incredible narcissist. He loved and lusted after publicity, but when he finally found himself in the spotlight, he used to shrink from it because he'd get anxiety. And before he gave a public lecture one day in Ballarat, there were 500 people there at the hotel, but he couldn't give it because he was in bed. And he needed James Nesbitt, who I'll get to bring him cups of tea and restore him and bring him back. He basically was broke as well. He was desperate for money. He was living off other people's loans. He'd created a lot of credit in the small towns where he was giving these great fiery sermons. He was very well known. He had this beautiful Irish lilt when he spoke. He gave these incredibly powerful sermons. He'd suddenly be quoting Wordsworth and Coleridge and all of the great poets, and then he'd be quoting off the top large chunks of the Bible. And they flocked to these old tin churches everywhere, all around country Victoria, to hear him. He ended up in Mount Egerton and formed a very intimate friendship with a young man who was working at the bank at the time. They fell out after about a month. And on a very foggy night, and this is a very cold part of the world, it's the tail end of the gold rush, miners are delivering all of their rocks and their nuggets every afternoon. Late at night, the young man was closing up the bank and he felt a gun at the back of his head. And there was a man with an Irish accent who walked with a limp, wearing a black crepe mask and a large hat and a large black overcoat. And eventually he took £1,000 in gold and cash from the Mount Egerton Bank and signed a note saying it had been perpetrated by Captain Moonlite. And thus the legend was born. The young man who worked at the bank was arrested and charged along with an accessory for robbing the bank. He got off. Suspicion always fell on Moonlite, on Andrew George Scott, who then mysteriously left town with a bag with a very large gold nugget in it and a lot of money. Got on a ship, goes to Fiji, buys himself a Pacific island with a promissory note that he never actually coughs up. Basically hoodwinks a whole bunch of businessmen over there for a cotton plantation, comes back to Australia, sails a ship virtually single-handed through the Heads in Sydney through a massive storm on the evening on Boxing Day. And goes on.
So like a Sydney to Hobart in reverse.
Essentially, massive storms. He's there holding onto the sails, gets them in, and he goes on a bender for about 9 months. Just loses himself. And we know this because he's seen passing forged cheques, and eventually the police catch up with him and he's jailed for 18 months. When he's released, he fakes insanity for a while, goes to Parramatta Asylum, where he meets this incredible array of some of the nastiest, worst criminals New South Wales has seen. They all find him repulsive because he's always planning these great escapes. Eventually, when he's released, he writes a letter to his father and he tells his father, I haven't been well for a while and I think I'm getting better. I'm feeling a lot stronger. You'll be pleased to hear. And I hope to see you and Mother very, very soon. He's got the letter in his pocket and he's about to post it, and a Victorian policeman arrives and charges him with the murder of, with the bank robbery in Mount Egerton. So they take him back. He's a massive celebrity. People are gathered in the train platforms watching him arrive. They put him in Ballarat jail, which is escape-proof. The locals think it's a state-of-the-art jail. 2 nights later, he goes over the top. He takes 6 other prisoners with him, and he's on the run for 10 days. He's recaptured. He is huge. If you go back and look at the newspapers at the time, they are just filled column after column after column about Captain Moonlite. He's jailed for 10 years, and he's sent to the Pentridge Stockade, which was one of the worst prisons in the Southern Hemisphere and probably the Western world at the time. They had the local hangman there was Michael Gately, whose party trick in the prison yard, because he was also a prisoner, was to get down on all fours and catch rats with his teeth and then put them on a skewer and roast them on a small fire, just a typical rat kebab. So he mixed with these sort of people, but it was there in about 1875 that a young punk from the streets of inner Melbourne, James Nesbitt, crossed paths with Andrew George Scott, and there was somehow an instant reaction, just chemistry between the two of them. James Nesbitt was a 24-year-old kid who'd been running with the gangs in inner Melbourne. His father, James Sr., was an absolute drunk who used to beat up his kids and his wife. You can go through the papers, you see all the reports about James Nesbitt Sr., the brute, they called him. Was once again before the court yesterday, charged with assaulting his wife and forcing them out of the home during a thunderstorm, so they were drenched. And so James Nesbitt, the younger, has been sentenced for 4 years for some petty theft. He meets Captain Moonlite, who is this erudite, charismatic, steel blue eyes, wonderful public speaker, who has dignity and honour and talks about all of these things all the time. And my theory is that Nesbitt saw almost a father figure in him, and they become, according to the prison authorities, inseparable. Now, I mean, tomorrow I'm addressing an historical society in Melbourne where they're going to grill me on where is my evidence that Captain Moonlite and James Nesbitt were gay lovers.
In prison, of all places.
Who'd have thunk it? Who would have thought it? You've got to remember that there are sodomy laws, strong sodomy laws in place at the time. In 1872 in Melbourne, there was a famous incident where two young men, Feeney and Marks, had been seen. They shared a room in the local hotel. They were often seen at the local bar, sometimes with one man's head in the other's lap, just cuddling up, acting as man and wife, as the newspapers said at the time. They decided their situation was hopeless. They could never be together properly, so what better way than to spend eternity with one another? So they bought pistols and they went to the Flagstaff Gardens in Melbourne, stood 10 yards apart and fired at each other. Well, the gun worked for one of them. I think it was Feeney or Marks. I always get confused. I've always got to go back and check it. Anyway, the other one was hanged. But they were both examined by doctors looking for evidence of their relationship. And it was the love that dare not speak its name and should never speak its name, as far as they were talking about in the Victorian era.
But I mean, you know, when we think of the Australian idea of mateship, you know, it's, you know, almost intrinsically, inherently connected in our psyche with the idea of blokey masculinity. But there are certain, you know, frontier researchers like Grace Karskens and others who suggest that the idea of the mate on the chain gang was similar to man and wife.
And there's no doubt it was very much a practice there that, if you go back to Norfolk Island, which was the hellhole, the convict hellhole in Australian history, and you come across reports there where the visiting governors and inspectors are horrified because they say, you know, in a population of 3,000 or 4,000 men, 90% of them are living as man and wife.
But of course, there were no women. I mean, until
there
the
were no
Third or
women.
Fourth Fleet,
No.
you know, there were no women at all.
And it's
Which
all
is kind
about
of weird for Sydney, isn't it? That all of a sudden women would be in demand.
But we know about Moonlite.
Am I right, ladies? Ask Gladys.
We know about Moonlite because as he sat in his death cell in Darlinghurst Jail in the weeks before he was hanged, he wrote dozens and dozens of letters. And you can go down to the New South Wales State Archives in Kingswood and request the file, and they'll bring it out and you've got to put on white gloves. But your hair on your neck really stands up. You get goosebumps. My arms look like, you know, chicken legs when I was reading them, because here on this blue-stained prison paper from early 1880 is Captain Moonlite's hand and the ink coming out of his fountain pen as he sat there night after night next to a candle, writing letters to people who he'd known throughout his life, who he wanted to thank. And he writes a letter to James Nesbitt's mother in Melbourne. Poor Mrs. Nesbitt. She's got this drunken ogre of a husband who's always beating her. And he's in and out of prison. The only relief she gets is when he's in jail. And her son has died. I'm not giving any secrets away. James Nesbitt gets shot dead during a siege. And Moonlite tells everyone, he was my soulmate. I not only want to be buried with him, I want to spend and sleep with him for eternity. It is to me, it's one of the great love stories of Australian history. And we're talking about an era when men did write to each other and they did express their profound love for one another. And you only have to go back to, you know, the man who circumnavigated Australia for the very first time, who wrote lots of letters to George Bass about their intense relationship, some of which were uncovered by his wife, who demanded to know what unnatural things have been taking place.
Ironically, naming a strait after him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they keep coming, don't they? I was a little bit slow on that one. But if you talk to someone like the historian Garry Wotherspoon, who, you know, has done a lot of research, and particularly a lot of research into gay Australia and the history of gay Australia, he is pretty much convinced that they were lovers in the physical sense, that they shared this intense bond. And you can see it in the letters. When Moonlite is about to be sentenced to death, a visitor comes to jail and he says, "Can I get you anything?" And he says, "Well, can you get some collars for all the boys who are part of the so-called gang? They need some paper collars so they can look like decent in court. And can you find James's clothes for me the ones that he died in, because I want to use them as a cerecloth. I want to be buried in them. And I want to be buried in the same grave. So please make sure. He was adamant about this. James and I had agreed to sleep with each other for eternity. We know that during the siege at Wantabadgery Station, where they'd taken 40 hostages, the general manager of the station...
Let's go back a bit. How did they end up in that situation? I mean,
well,
once
this
you've
is
got
what
40 people as hostages, it's kind
There's
of
not
a
much
hard
of
one to get out of.
It's very hard to find an exit strategy. It began in Melbourne, 1879, when Moonlite was released from Pentridge, and waiting for him was Nesbitt, who'd been released a few months earlier. And they decided, Moonlite said, honour, dignity, outraged by the treatment he'd received in Pentridge, I'm going to go on a public lecture circuit and I'm going to tell the world how appalling this reformatory system is. There is no such thing as reformation. There's no such thing as an opportunity for a man who's committed a crime to become reformed and go out into society and be accepted again. They just put us in small cells, they whip us, they give us terrible food. And so he went on this public lecture circuit. And he had the hide to go to Ballarat, where he'd escaped from the jail, and Mount Egerton at one stage. In Ballarat, he spoke in front of 500 people at the Unicorn Hotel. They'd paid a penny each to go and hear him. And he arrived and he electrified the room. They said when he walked in, the reporters were sitting there and they could smell the scent on his skin. He was oiled up and not a hair was out of place. He had a beautiful suit with a cravat and the whole thing. He looked magnificent, big bushy beard, well groomed, and he spoke. He was electrifying for an hour and a half. Loved an audience. Once he got started, you couldn't stop him. Once again, the great poets, the classics, the whole thing. But eventually it wore, the novelty wore off and people started, oh, there's Moonlite going on again. He hired a theatrical agent, Richard Thatcher, to look after his PR for him at one stage. But the police kept following him and James around. But Moonlite also had this capacity he was like a magnet for young, broken men. They flocked to him, and I think he also looked for them as well because he thought he could actually save them. It was part of his psychology. He found a young man on the streets, flea-ridden, suffering from a disease called Gus Wernicke. He was 14. His dad owned a pub and a local brothel, and he'd been kicked out of home because he fell out with his new stepmother. So he looked after him, bought him a feed, and Gus Wernicke started hanging around him and James Nesbitt. Tom Rogan, a bit of a petty thief and a bootmaker, he joined the group. And it suddenly looked like he was putting together a football team. At the boarding house in North Melbourne where he was staying, there were sometimes up to 7 or 8 young men coming by. But the police kept harassing him, following him around. They set off a false rumour that he was planning to join up with Ned Kelly and join forces and have one last great showdown of the Bushrangers, which would have been a magnificent thing.
Did you ever cross paths with Ned?
There's a 6-month window when you match up all of the dates when he was in Pentridge, when Ned was there as well, before Ned was taken off and moved somewhere else. And I suspect pretty much that they would have crossed paths, but they wouldn't have had much in common. I mean, Ned was the son of an alcoholic pig farmer, a pig thief from Ireland, and you've got this erudite sort of Bible-thumping, speech-loving, classic poetry-reading guy and Andrew George Scott. So I really don't think they would have hit it off. I think Ned would have looked at him and thought he was a wanker, essentially, or a tosser.
What about that other great bushranger? Did he ever cross paths with Frederick Ward, Captain Thunderbolt?
No, because Thunderbolt was rotting. He was dead killed in 1870, and Moonlite had been in Australia, but he was in Victoria in 1869, so they don't quite cross paths. And by then, a lot of the bushrangers were starting to fade out. Like I said, they were running out of room to hide. In the end, I think Moonlite said, look, we're not going to get a job here. He'd gone for jobs and the police had gone in and said, you know who you're going to hire? Don't hire him. So he said, let's get out of here. We'll go to New South Wales, the colony up there. Hopefully we can get some work. And it's the height of a recession. So they, on foot, walk from Melbourne to the Murray River, head towards Gundagai. There are thousands of men doing the same, swagmen, men unemployed, looking for work, going from one farmhouse to another, one small town to another. They get by, they shoot a sheep at one stage, which they're a bit embarrassed about. This is why I say they're accidental bushrangers. They're looking for work and dough. They hear that Wantabadgery Station, which has this fantastic reputation for itinerant travellers, you can go there, they'll let you sleep in the hut for the night. They might even give you some food and maybe a bit of work if the stables need cleaning. They arrive there one night in November. They're rudely told to go away. It's under new management. They go into the hills, it pours rain, they've run out of food. Moonlight's embarrassed because he's told this group of 5 young men that he's gathered around him that he's going to provide for them and he's going to make sure they can get some work and do something decent with their lives. So they go back the next day, they're knocked back again, and by now this sense of dignity and respect and honour that he has, and plus the madness and the narcissism that's sort of simmering within takes over, and he says, let's hold the place up. So they lay siege, and initially just to get some food. They raid the larder, they have a big feast. But Wantabadgery is this central hub in this area for lots of travellers and local business people. And they start arriving, they're dropping off horses, they're picking up cattle, and he has to take everyone hostage because he doesn't want word to get out. They're at suddenly they've got up to, over 48 hours, they've got 40 people under the same roof. And he's also going a bit mad. You know, he's sort of taken with this notion that he is the great Captain Moonlight, and he holds mock trials, and he threatens to shoot the William Baines, the local general manager. Anyway, you'll see it in the book, but it all starts going downhill, and there's the Wagga Wagga police arrive, and it's like a Keystone Cops because Nesbitt and Moonlight, and particularly Moonlight, is so well trained with guns, take them on. And the Wagga police are left running for their lives, running through a small dam, leave their horses behind, incredibly embarrassed. And it's not until the Gundagai police arrive to reinforce them that there's a final showdown a few miles down the road at McLeod's hut. And it's there that a trooper is shot and will later die. No one will ever know whose bullet lodged in his neck, but the poison from that bullet eventually kills him within days. James Nesbitt is shot through the temple, and as the police arrest them all and mop up, Gus Wernicke lies dead on the ground.
He was only 14 or 15,
Yeah, 15, just turned 15. But he said to him, Captain, I'm okay, you know, I'm glad we did this. Some of it's been embellished by the journos of the time, who are, surprise, surprise, prone to doing that kind of beating things up. Moonlight hears about Nesbitt, he's been shot, bursts into the hut, picks him up and starts kissing him passionately. And the word passionately is the key word here. And there's reports that the troopers who were standing around were sneering and laughing at him. It's as though he was trying to breathe life back into James and bring him back to life. But he essentially dies in his arms. Moonlight's distraught. They're taken to Gundagai, there's a preliminary hearing, then they're sent to Sydney. On their way to Sydney, on the train to Sydney overnight, they have to stop at all these small country towns, and in the heat, hundreds of locals, the word goes out, and hundreds of locals start arriving, and they're standing on all these platforms, just leering into the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the incredible Captain Moonlight. And he's a huge celebrity, but not in that way. They don't support him because a copper has been killed. And he finds, by the time he arrives in Sydney, they pull in at Newtown, there is essentially 12,000 people gathered on the streets. The car arrives, or the cart, to take him to Darlinghurst Jail. And it's there that he's locked away and goes on trial very quickly. Within 3 weeks, the word was in, fixed this problem up. We can't have these bushrangers embarrassing us anymore. The fix was in. The judge, Windayer, his brother had once owned Wantabadgery Station until earlier that year. Incredible conflicts. If it was staged now, you'd never get away with it. And the law back then was that if you were part of a group or a gang, you could be all charged with murder if someone had been killed. You didn't have to prove whose bullet or who fired the gun. You were all responsible. And so they were all found guilty. 4 of them who had survived. In the end, it was Tom Rogan, and who had hidden under a cot for the entire siege, crying, hiding from the police, never fired a shot in anger. He was to hang with Moonlight. And that's where they actually step out on the gallows on the morning of the 20th of January 1880 at Darlinghurst Jail. There's about 5,000, 6,000 people gathered around the precincts, all of them trying to get a look, some claiming they could see the rope, ripple going through the crowd. And it's when they step onto that scaffold And Moonlight's pale and haggard. You know, his beard's gone, he's unshaven for 3 or 4 days. Those steel blue eyes have been dulled. And he comes face to face with my favourite character of the book.
Now, we'll get to your favourite character in a second, but of course, you know, drunk Irish pig farming son, Ned Kelly, is famous.
Well, I get in trouble, I think so.
He's famous for his last words, such as life.
Yep.
Did Moonlight have anything to say as eloquently?
No, he leaned over, he promised, Rogan the night before had sent a message to Moonlight through the chaplain of the prison saying, it's going to be tough enough going out there tomorrow. Can you please, for once in your life, resist the urge to make a grand speech? You know, please, just for me. And Moonlight agreed to that. But when he walked out onto the scaffold and the gallows and he looked down in the courtyard, there were about 40 people there who'd been given tickets to get in to watch. And one of them was J.F. Archibald, the founder of the Bulletin, who was preparing the very first issue. And he was covering, you know, had covered the trial and was now going to cover the execution. And Moonlight looked down and he said, "What are all these people doing here? I think I should say something." And Canon Rich walked over to him and said, "No, you've promised Tom not to do anything, so please." So he just leaned over and grabbed Tom on the hand and said, "You know, we made a mistake. We did a bad thing, Tom." And with that, the covering was, the mask was put over their heads and the rope was adjusted on their necks, and they stood there on the trapdoor.
Now, I remember the first time I went to prison because I worked for Corrective Services. And I went to the infamous 3 Wing at Long Bay where, you know, 18 men had been hanged over the years after it was built. And I remember feeling an incredible eeriness wash over me. Now, you've described the feeling you had when you read, you know, Moonlight's hand. How did you feel when you stood in the spot where he had hanged?
The prison itself has changed. It's now the National Art School. So you go down there and you can wander in. No one at the door most of the time. But I was lucky I had Deborah Beck, who's the archivist down there. She took me around. And where the gallows were has now been enclosed. So it's a very tiny sort of courtyard. But when you stand there and you stand directly under the spot where the trapdoor had been, it's the strangest feeling. It is the strangest feeling. And I still don't quite know how I felt that day, because by then I was starting to, I was having a love-hate relationship with Moonlight. Throughout writing the book, there were days when I loved him, and there were days when I wanted to punch him because he was so annoying, and I think he had that effect on most people, really. But when you see that, then you understand the absolute brutality of hanging a man by the neck as a way of executing them. And there'd been a series of bungles, and I found it really interesting that 6 months before he was hanged, there was a protest in the Domain in Sydney. 10,000 people gathered. A young Aboriginal man called Alfred had been sentenced to hang in Mudgee for the rape of a 60-year-old woman. Very flimsy case. It looked as though, you know, they'd found the local Aboriginal boy and decided, "You're it. We need someone to blame." So they trumped up these charges and he was to hang. And in the weeks leading up to it, 10,000 people gathered and went on a death march. And they played Handel's Death March on muffled drums, and they carried candles and kerosene lamps, and they walked through the city to protest that the colonial government of the time was still willing to execute men, particularly an Aboriginal man. And the Evening News had a headline, "Well, hang him, because he's just black. That's why you can get away with it." You know, and they were being incredibly honest and sarcastic about it. So you've got this groundswell of, you know, public opinion that's now moving against capital punishment. I mean, most people still think it's okay to hang a man if he's murdered someone in cold blood, and that's why there weren't that many protests over Moonlight's execution. But probably the most reviled man in Australia at the time was a battle between Captain Moonlight and Robert Rice Howard.
Now, Robert Rice Howard, he is, I know, one of your favourite characters, and he was one of
Well,
my
the favourite
favourite characters. And About as fascinating and complex as Moonlight. Who was Robert Rice Howard?
He was the state executioner for New South Wales from about 1878 through to about 1906.
But no one ever thought of him as Mr. Howard, did they?
No, never called him Mr. Howard. He was known as Nosy Bob because he didn't have a nose. He was a handsome cab driver back in the 1860s.
Sorry, so when you say he was a handsome cab driver, does that mean
well, he was a very good-looking, handsome cab driver. He drove a handsome cab, which was essentially a two-seater cart with a horse, and he had the Darling Point cab run. So he looked after a lot of influential and wealthy people at the time, and he was quite well known. Good-looking bloke. Unfortunately, a horse kicked out one day and kicked off his nose, and it caved his face right in here. And there weren't great plastic surgeons in the eastern suburbs at the time, so he just had a hole where his nose used to be. So naturally, that great Australian sense of humour, he was called Nosy Bob. He couldn't continue with his cab driving, so he ended up taking on the role of state executioner when it became vacant because he needed a job. His wife had died in 1878, so he was raising his 3 daughters and 2 boys on his own. He lived in a small place in Paddington that he was very proud of his veggie patch out the back, his grapes at the front. Later on, he will move to Ben Buckler Point at Bondi Beach. He'll have a beautiful little cottage there. He'll take large hooks and put a big chunk of meat on them, throw them into the middle of the bay, and then attach it to his horse, and when a shark bites it and takes the bait, he'll get his horse to haul the sharks in. So he loves his shark hunting, he raises pigs. Very eccentric guy. But he's such an incredibly rich character, and he's despised because he's the hangman. All executioners throughout history. Johnny Sketch, they used to call them. They were ridiculed, humiliated. They had to live away. The hangman in Melbourne used to wear a fake beard so that no one knew his true identity. Nosy Bob, people would see him coming down the street, they'd cross to the other side and hide their kids. And they called him a ghoul in the newspapers because of his looks, his features, and he sort of fit the role. He looked perfect for the job. He was this brute who wore a long frock coat and a frilly shirt whenever he executed someone because he wanted to look the part and impress the local governor and the VIPs and the politicians because they were the people he relied on to keep his job. It was a craft to him. You know, you had to boil the rope. You had to know a man's weight so you could estimate the drop that he required. You had to ensure that the knot had been soaked so that when they fell and they suddenly jolted, that it was just behind the left ear so that the neck would snap between the second and third vertebrae. There was all of this emerging science that was coming around, but they never quite got it right because at about the same time that he was heading to Mudgee to execute young Alfred, a Brisbane hanging had taken place, and an unusual cold front had come through, and the rope they used had been out in the frost overnight, and it was so stiff it decapitated the poor man who had plummeted to his death. And for some reason, I just found Nosy Bob an incredible character, and so I decided to structure the book so that you start with Nosy Bob on the evening of the hanging, getting ready. You start with Moonlight, getting prepared for his hanging, writing his last letters, and then at the end of the book, they suddenly meet on the gallows.
I think there's this wonderful kind of tension and paradox, you know, in the way that people who have to do the jobs we don't want to do,
Yep.
whether it's prison guards or executioners or parking wardens, you know, are also the people we revile the most. Now, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to know, you know, Phil Graham, the legendary journalist and Washington Post publisher, said famously that journalism was the rough first draft of history. Yep. And you've been at the coalface of the rough first draft of history, especially in your work at Fairfax and Channel 9. So, as a journalist, what attracts you to history?
Well, the publishers were keen on me doing some historical books because they thought there was a lot of room to sort of start digging around on some of those lesser known stories. And, you know, I did William Buckley, and I was lucky because I'd grown up in the area, that Wadawurrung country, and had heard a lot of stories about Buckley. But Moonlight had always sort of fascinated me as well because he was we were getting back to our very first point that we started talking about, why don't we know that much more about him compared to Ned Kelly? And I think it was because of his relationship with James Nesbitt, and when you read between the lines, and there's always this wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of, the guy's gay, And, you know, he was called a puff by the general manager of the Wantabadgery station during the siege. You know, he referred to James Nesbitt as a puff. And that was the slang back in the 1880s for a gay man. And it later, you know, evolved into that word that we all became familiar with in the 60s and 70s around Australia. So, and you read the letters to the editor, and there's a couple of crucial letters there that talk about the relationship of men when they're in prison. And it never quite goes into details, but it hints at this dark, sordid environment where older men entrap young men and then keep them as their partners forever. And right through it all, there is the case mounts that they probably were gay. And I think it's undoubtedly that they had a relationship. But I think it's because of that he was kind of airbrushed out.
But why was there so much stigma associated with his relationship to Nesbitt when Kelly's relationship to Joe, who wrote the Jewelery letter for him, may have also been...
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of that's part of the mythology. Like, it's the true history of the Kelly gang, which was the false history that was written by Peter Carey. And suddenly the novel becomes the true history that, you know, and I went back and read it last year when I was doing Moonlite, because I wanted to refresh my mind about what a bloody marvellous book that is. And just so brilliantly pulled off. But there's all the cross-dressing going on, and then you saw the movie that was made, you know, earlier this year when it came out, and, you know, a lot of people I was disappointed because, you know, I thought, what are we doing with a skinhead blonde punk playing Ned Kelly? At least give me the beard, because if you can't, there are certain things you can't mess with, and one of them is the beard with the bushranger. I mean, everyone had a beard back then. That's what all men had, big and thick and bushy. I mean, they're now just baristas, aren't they? That's where we've seen it carried on. But it was that whole barista look. They didn't have, well, they did have tats, but they weren't sort of like those little rings around. So, you know, I think because of that relationship that he had with Nesbitt, the Kelly stuff came out later on. There was a couple of comments there that were made, an incredibly open comment by one of them when he said, if I find him, I'm going to, you know, find his dead body and do something with it. And just remarkable, but it was never overtly looked at, whereas in the Moonlite story, it's there between the lines all the time. You can feel people talking about it, or, oh, I don't know about him, he's a puff, or, you know, they've got a very unusual relationship, or he kissed him passionately all over his face. You know, that wasn't the done thing back then. And it is all wound up in that kind of the mateship and all of those things that have become part of the national character or the national stereotype, if you like. You know, this whole notion of what is mateship anyway? It's hardly anything unusual anywhere in the world, I would have thought. We've clung to it for a while because, you know, we're supposedly forged in the trenches at Gallipoli and all the other cliches that we've heard, and it's another part of our mythology.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the only time anyone ever calls me mate is when they're about to throw me out of a bar, or I've walked into a trendy jeans shop and the young person there doesn't want to deal with me. Yep. You all right, mate?
Because normally it's bro. It's bro these days, isn't it? Or dude.
I don't know. I haven't been into a trendy jeans shop for a while, John.
I can see, yeah.
Gary?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we'll take some questions from you. If you're on Facebook Live, don't forget you can ask a question underneath the comments. And if you're here in the room, please raise your hand. I'll repeat the question for all our friends watching on Facebook Live. Now, remember, I will be looking for a question, so not a statement, a meander, rumination. I will be listening for the inflection at the end, okay? And if you do meander on, I will be forced to wind you up. So please keep it short and sweet. Any questions for Gary about the incredible Captain Moonlite?
Were when Scott was exhumed from Sydney and taken back down to Gundagai, was that a group of just nice people, or
no? There was two. So that's a very important part of the story that I haven't mentioned here. But
so as it turns out, Captain Moonlight's hanging. No, Captain Moonlight's hanging.
Damn, there goes the ending of the book.
Was not the end
Spoiler
of his story.
alert.
Was not the end of his story. As it turns out, it involves an exhumation from Sydney to Gundagai. So Who was responsible for this? Was it the authorities or nice people?
Two women in Gundagai who came
When?
across the story. Well, it was all bound up in the letters in the late 1990s. All of those letters that he wrote in his death cell were seized by the jail authorities and they never sent. The letter he wrote to Mrs. Nesbitt never arrived. With a lock of James's hair, it never arrived. It was put in a box and locked up. And then a couple of historical researchers came across them and ignited a lot of interest. And word got around, a couple of very smaller books and limited run editions were brought out containing some of the letters. Two women in Gundagai heard about it and said, why isn't he buried here? Why can't we bring him down here? So they started a campaign. They campaigned, they lobbied the state government, they lobbied the Anglican Church. He was out at Rookwood Cemetery. And finally in 1995, he was exhumed and taken to Gundagai Cemetery where James Nesbitt is buried. Now, they weren't buried in the same grave because no one knows where Nesbitt's buried. He was buried in an anonymous grave for criminals. And there's no record of it anymore. But at least they're nearby, you know, and Moonlight's buried under a beautiful rock that he wanted to be buried under with the wording exactly how he had expressed he'd wanted it.
And what does it say on his headstone?
I'd have to go through the book again, word for word, but it talks about, I want a rough-hewn rock, and to say that, you know, I was born on this day and died, and he actually wanted James Nesbitt's name on it as well, to say that they both now rest together and sleep together. And it was sort of like, they had a colonial-style funeral for him, where they all dressed up in colonial gear and had the drums and the local band played. And so it's kind of like a fitting end. And I guess it's sort of laid to rest too, a lot of the speculation, because I think the longer this has gone on now, the more people are more comfortable with the fact that he was gay. And I think there was a bit of resistance to that at the start. People used to say, oh, those letters, that is not proof. But when you go through it and you see the people who have now, you know, Gary Wotherspoon is one of the great historians in this country. He's pretty well convinced that the two of them had an incredibly intense love affair, one of the great love affairs in Australian history.
Look, you've convinced me, and I think you've convinced everyone in the room. You've just got to...
I have no doubts. I started off with doubts when I started the book. I was a bit sceptical, but by halfway through, when I'd read the letters and when you read the newspaper articles, thousands of pages you've got to sit there on Trove on the National Library website, which is a brilliant resource. But you go through them and you just see... You become accustomed to the...
You were so going to convince that Melbourne Historical Society to...
I hope so, because they're going to really interrogate me.
You've really pleaded the case. If only you were at the trial.
Yeah. Well, I reckon I would have got him off. He defended himself, Moonlight. He gave some magnificent speeches, but it's all in the book.
Any other questions for Garry? Up the back?
Garry, just interested to know how strongly these stories resonated back in the day, back in Ireland.
Yeah,
So I'll just repeat it for Facebook Live. How strongly did these stories resonate with people back in Ireland?
Well, you go through the Newry Gazette and a couple of the others, which were the local newspapers in that part of Northern Ireland, and I've been back then. They carried lengthy reports because he was the son of a well-known man who'd been involved in some of the big disputes between Catholics and Protestants in that country, and was recognised by the Irish Parliament for his work there. So his name was on the front pages of the newspapers throughout New Zealand, England. You go through the UK newspaper archive there. He was huge. There's a guy who writes to one of the Sydney newspapers, and he writes a letter halfway through the trial, and he said, will you please desist from publishing so much information about the trial of the Moonlite gang? Because I have 3 young daughters, and my custom is that before I go into town every day for work, I have a drink, a breakfast, and I read the newspaper. But now the girls are up early, and as soon as the newspaper arrives, they're devouring every word of the Moonlite gang's exploits down at Wantabadgery. So please stop this, because so you have almost like a celebrity culture. You know, not quite like we know now, but they were the celebrities of that era. And whether or not they were liked or loved or loathed, people followed their stories. And the Moonlite story was so complex because, you know, he had this gang of young men. They weren't really bushrangers. They couldn't even ride horses properly or shoot a gun. And the nature of the killing of the trooper who'd been shot, it may have been Gus Wernicke's bullet, it may have been Moonlight, we'll never know. But the whole nature of it, and that point in time when people are rising up and saying, let's get rid of this convict stain, we don't need it anymore, we want to become the true Australia. Getting rid of the bushrangers was foremost top and centre of their minds, and they just wanted to get their act clean up and get rid of that old Australia. Incredibly embarrassed by it.
Yeah, it's interesting though when you look back over the last even 100 years from celebrities, so-called criminal celebrities like Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine or Phil the Jew Jeffs, or even onwards to someone like, say, people like Roger Rogerson and Chopper Read, who built huge media careers out of their notoriety. It almost feels as if history is kind of repeating itself again.
Now, I always talk about the history. There are so many echoes from the past that you can, if you read closely and listen closely enough, you can hear them. The people rising up in Sydney in 1879 saying that's enough of capital punishment. That's enough of our bad treatment of Indigenous people. This can't go on. I mean, there was rising resentment about that. The way that we've treated and revered, in a way, criminals. And it's not just us, it's everywhere. As I said, those British detective crime shows put on a thing about whether or not it's the Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal, or it's some mass serial murderer, people will flock to it. And it's a sense of, it's why we stop when there's a traffic accident. We all say we don't, but we all do. We slow down. We're obsessed with train wrecks, with pain being inflicted on other people. We discussed this the other day, that fear that we all have that it could be done to us as well. And I think that's what keeps us on edge all the time, that there's a bogeyman out there. It's that whole under the bed thing.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, and thank you, Garry, for such a thrilling conversation. Moonlight's published by Penguin Books, and you can get a signed copy. And Gary's available for a chat when he signs your copy at the end of tonight, which you can buy tonight. It's a real steal.
Thanks for having me.
Now, if you're watching us live on FB Live, you can also get a signed copy with free postage if you're in Balmain or surrounding areas by completing the order form on the FB Live page, or go to roaringstories.com.au and sign up for our newsletter packed with exclusive offers, new releases, interviews with your favourite authors, events and more. And November is going to be a very big month with some of our best known authors writing about some of our biggest topics. I'm Sunil Badami, and I hope we'll see you again at another Roaring Stories online author event, either here at the Royal Oak, in the shop, or on FB Live. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, mate. Thank you.